welcome to History 2023, Arkansas History. Lecture title, Arkansas Divided. 1954 would turn out to be a fairly decisive year for Arkansas history. Some of the events that year would occur within the state itself, and some would occur well beyond its borders, but together they had a decisive effect on the next decade or two, if not even longer. And though this could be said for several different aspects of life in the state, it applied especially to the developing civil rights movement, for which Little Rock, rather against most people's expectations, would soon provide one of the most memorable flashpoints. To set the stage for all of this, we must first turn to the 1954 gubernatorial election, in which the incumbent, Francis Cherry, was defeated in the Democratic primary contest by a relative unknown, Orville Eugene Faubus, who would go on to win the general election, naturally, and become one of the most polarizing politicians in the state's history, which, given everything we've seen up to now, is saying something. Because of the infamous incident that would mar his tenure concerning school desegregation, Faubus is sometimes assumed today to have been a total reactionary, standing for the Old South and the rule of white planters and all that. Nothing could be farther from the truth. Born in Madison County in 1910, his father was an out-and-out socialist who named his children for left-wing political heroes. Orville's middle name was in honor of Eugene Debs, one of America's leading socialist politicians at that time. In the 1930s, Faubus attended Commonwealth College in Mena, a similarly left-wing school which, during this decade, was heavily involved with the Southern Tenant Farmers Union and its activities. In fact, it was this particular school which enemies of the STFU pointed to as evidence of the group's supposed communist leanings. Faubus never seemed to regret his presence at Commonwealth, though, and after serving in the war, he returned to Madison County and bought a newspaper in Huntsville, using it to demand more action from the state government on education, road construction, and healthcare. He supported McMath's bid for governor in 1948 with its reformist campaign, was brought into the administration as a result, and used this to challenge McMath's successor, Cherry, in 1954, and winning despite Cherry's attempt to smear him as a possible communist. Under other circumstances, Faubus might still be championed as a heroic figure in the most progressive tradition of the Democratic Party, not only in Arkansas, but nationwide. Early on in his tenure, he significantly raised pay for public school teachers and set in motion some other reforms to make education in the state more efficient. He would also oversee the improvement of the Arkansas State Hospital, devoted to the treatment of the mentally ill, and in 1959 established the Arkansas Children's Colony in Conway to serve the state's mentally handicapped children. This was something he had pressed for since first becoming governor, and its success would lead to the formation of similar facilities across the state in later years. And as we'll get into later, he was instrumental in the fight over whether or not to dam the Buffalo River, one of the first episodes in the modern American environmentalist movement. All of this had a big impact on conditions in the state, and I suppose it's unfair, in a way, for Faubus to have gone down in history as the enemy of civil rights above all else. But that is what happened. The case of Brown versus Board of Education, ruled on by the U.S. Supreme Court in the spring of 1954, is often considered the starting point for the modern civil rights movement. It did not directly concern Arkansas, or the South more generally, but rather the school system in Topeka, Kansas, where black children were forced to attend a school some miles away rather than the whites-only district closer at hand. But the ruling issued by the court did indeed concern schools nationwide. Standing the old case of Plessy versus Ferguson on its head, the justices declared that the old rule of separate but equal, used to justify racial segregation of schools and other institutions up to now, was in fact inherently unequal, pointing to the wide gap in quality that often existed between the two races in terms of educational services and much else. Therefore, they added, all school districts, if not already integrated, must do so with, quote, all deliberate speed. Now, I may as well add in now that the charge of uneven quality was often all too accurate in Arkansas schools. Black institutions received far less funding, the teachers were paid much less, and while some schools did have fairly good books and equipment, for many, these were very scarce and on a much more basic level. Indeed, this had become an increasingly common complaint among civil rights leaders in the state during the 1940s and early 1950s. As the textbook notes, the tone and extent of the court's ruling caught observers off guard nationwide, so it's hardly surprising that Arkansans were stunned by the news as well. Because of this, there was no coordinated response at first from any direction. On the one hand, some of the older generation of Black leaders were hesitant and not at all pleased by the desegregation order. They had mainly wanted to improve funding and services for the existing Black schools and feared, accurately as it turned out, that throwing together white and Black students would not only aggravate tensions but cause these decades-old schools, in many cases long-standing pillars of the Black communities, to evaporate. As the movement gathered steam, though, they would be overtaken by younger and more outspoken types who felt it necessary to go to the wall on this issue. If the system of school segregation was broken, they felt, then many of the other rights they were fighting for would more easily fall into place. This group included leaders of the NAACP and other national civil rights organizations who saw white opposition as something that would simply have to be overridden. That was all. On the other hand, white citizens were not universally opposed to desegregation. Many absolutely were, of course. Some continued to hold intense racial prejudice against African Americans and saw integration as forcing them to be equals with a fundamentally unequal entity, an attitude probably at its most intense in the Delta, given the biracial demographics there, while others didn't feel quite so strongly about that, but seriously objected to such an order from the federal courts, which, they felt, had no legal authority to intervene in state and local affairs. These segregationists, as we'll call them for shorthand, began organizing during the mid-1950s, forming so-called citizens' councils that warned of the dangers of, quote, race mixing, demanded total opposition to desegregation by their elected officials, and attempted to purge school officials and anyone else in favor of carrying it out. Though these groups would, naturally, get a lot of attention, they by no means spoke for all white Arkansans. Plenty took up a more moderate position, including church leaders, urban businessmen who saw racial controversy as economically damaging, and others who might or might not like desegregation, but felt that open violence and dissension would be worse than simply going ahead with it. How these two groups squared off and how desegregation was implemented varied from one community to another, but there was typically less resistance to it in areas where, first, the Black population was pretty small and could be integrated without too much fuss, and second, local leaders worked to keep it as quiet as possible. This was the case in the Franklin County community of Charleston, where school leaders decided on integration in the summer of 1954. There were only 11 school-age Black children anyway, as opposed to 480 whites, but did not announce it until several weeks after the fact. In the process, it became the first public school anywhere in the South to desegregate, and was followed shortly thereafter by Fayetteville, where much the same formula was used. It should be added that this wasn't strictly idealism on school leaders' part. There was also the consideration that with so few Black students in these districts, integration was honestly cheaper than having to maintain full separate facilities for them. Journalists from across the nation showed up to Fayetteville to report on any violent protests that occurred when integration went through. Evidently, to their disappointment, there weren't any. Initially, then, it seemed things might play out in a peaceful and straightforward manner. However, when Hoxie in Lawrence County tried a similar approach in 1955, it all started to blow up. The first couple weeks of integration went fine, but then reporters from Life magazine showed up and did an expose on the town, much to its leader's annoyance, one would assume from subsequent events, and that painted a target on its back. Supporters of continuing segregation began flocking to Hoxie, some from as far away as Little Rock, and holding rallies condemning the school board and pressuring its members to resign. However, the board members were evidently as irked with the outsiders for showing up and interfering as they were at the reporters for getting them into this mess in the first place, and refused to resign, and a lawsuit between the two sides was ultimately decided in their favor the following year. As a result of events in Hoxie, segregationists redirected their aim, now focusing on leading politicians in the state and putting pressure on them to prevent desegregation from being carried out. And at the time, of course, there was no higher politician than Faubus himself. The governor's exact views on race relations are hard to make out in hindsight. Though I doubt he was ever in favor of total racial equality, most white Arkansans at the time would not have been, he was in no way on the violent end of the spectrum either. He seems not to have generally engaged in racial slurs or things of that nature, and like his predecessor, McMath, he had appointed African Americans to positions in state government and continued funding for black schools and colleges. The consensus now is that Faubus's subsequent actions were motivated more by political calculation than by sheer racism. With the segregationist wing in the state becoming more organized and vocal, ignoring them might well lead to a serious challenge in the 1958 elections, so it was best to move in their direction and make them feel like he was one of them. By the summer of 1957, then, Faubus had evidently made up his mind to take a stand against desegregation. And there was no better place to do so than right there in the Capitol. Immediately after the Brown versus Board decision, the Little Rock School Board had begun putting together a plan for gradual desegregation, starting with Central High School in fall 1957. With petitions flooding in from white parents demanding that integration be halted or else, school officials asking for guarantees of the students' safety, and possibly their own, and federal officials refusing to step in and provide the necessary protection, Faubus ordered the National Guard out on September 2nd to guard Central High School and prevent violence from breaking out, even if that meant refusing entry to the black students. Sure enough, on the morning of September 4th, 9 African American high school students, carefully chosen by local civil rights leaders, attempted to gain entry to the school, but with protesters surrounding the building, they were turned back by the National Guard. One of them, 15-year-old Elizabeth Eckford, got isolated and had to make her way through an angry mob of students and adults that spat on her and pelted her with debris, an event that made its way into the national news at once and became a searing image to many Americans of the South and of the civil rights movement. In reality, of course, it was more complicated than that. Many moderates, white and black, were working behind the scenes to defuse tensions, a group including a number of local clergymen and editors of the Arkansas Gazette, convinced that this would trash the state's reputation. Having staked out their positions, though, neither Faubus nor the segregationists nor the federal judges and other officials would compromise, and everything remained in deadlock for the next 2 weeks, with the members who had just tried to get into the school staying at home to avoid more bad treatment by the mobs. Then, on September 20th, the federal courts ordered Faubus to stop using the National Guard to obstruct school integration at once. Faubus's response was, "You got it," and simply pulled the Guard off campus entirely, leaving Little Rock police to try and handle the situation themselves. The result, when the Little Rock Nine, as they were now being called, tried to re-enter school on the 23rd, was a near riot. They made it into the school this time, but the cops had their hands full trying to contain the mob outside, and by lunchtime had pulled them out of school for their own safety. This last event seems to have caused President Dwight Eisenhower, who had not been a big fan of the Brown v. Board decision either, but was determined to see the federal government's authority upheld, to lose his temper. He placed the National Guard under federal supervision immediately and sent the U.S. Army's 101st Airborne Division into Little Rock to maintain order. 2 days later, the Little Rock Nine returned to school under the protection of soldiers and remained through the rest of the year. Faubus did not exactly help matters by going on television and announcing that the city was, quote, now an occupied territory, and in the months to come, especially after the withdrawal of the soldiers in November, the Little Rock Nine would be subject to verbal and physical harassment, even bomb threats. When Ernest Green, the only senior in the bunch, graduated in May 1958, he dryly remarked, "It's been an interesting year. I've had a course in human relations firsthand." The completion of a full year at Central High School, though, was not the end of the trouble. In the summer of 1958, with the courts demanding that Little Rock carry on with its original desegregation plan, Faubus, who was in fact cruising to re-election now, convened the state legislature and rammed through a bill allowing any school being threatened with integration to simply shut down altogether. In mid-September, that legislation was carried out, and not just Central, but all high schools in Little Rock were closed, inaugurating what became known as the Lost Year. The nearly 4,000 students in the district, white and black, were locked out, and though faculty and staff were contractually obligated to continue showing up to work, there was basically nothing for them to do. There was a brief attempt to teach via local television, but otherwise, no education of any kind was conducted for the entirety of the school year. Although, I kid you not, Faubus issued an executive order allowing the high schools to still play a full football schedule. Over the course of the year, most white students were transferred into other public schools out of Little Rock, some as far away as Jacksonville, or into hastily organized private schools. Some black students transferred as well, but no private institutions were set up for them, the NAACP and other civil rights groups believing that to do so would defeat the purpose, and so roughly half of them had no schooling at all that year, leading some to drop out altogether. By the time the school year, quote-unquote, ended in May 1959, most white parents, segregationist or moderate, had had enough of the chaos of the lost year, and that summer, the newly reorganized Little Rock School Board made plans to reopen the high schools in August 1959 with a very small number of black students allowed to attend as a sign of good faith to the courts. Not that such good faith necessarily existed, but still. Whatever the motivations of the segregationists, and whatever Faubus hoped to achieve by aligning with them, the way in which their opposition played out has to be considered a negative for the state, in that it yielded no tangible benefits. Large-scale desegregation in the capital had been delayed, yes, and Faubus had shored up his political career, but at the cost of introducing a new degree of racial antagonism and giving the state a whole lot of negative publicity it neither wanted nor needed. The mob activity surrounding the Little Rock Nine caused Arkansans to be seen elsewhere in the nation as a bunch of bigoted rednecks, and Faubus in particular was forever afterwards tarred as an arch-segregationist, an image that overshadowed his very real constructive work in a number of other fields. Plus, the violence in Little Rock almost certainly damaged race relations in other communities in the state, disrupting plans for a quiet and smooth integration that many white and black local leaders desired. Some towns, such as Sheridan, got cold feet and delayed desegregation plans they had written up, while in Van Buren, which actually had integrated in 1957, simultaneous with the first burst of activity in Little Rock without much trouble, protests and threats of violence broke out the following year, and students and faculty alike declared that this never would have happened if those in the capital hadn't set a bad example for everyone else. In a way, the infighting over school desegregation showed all parties in the contest to be right and wrong to an extent. If the Supreme Court and black civil rights leaders had believed integration to be something one could just decree, they were mistaken. As it turned out, segregationists had many ways of obstructing or delaying such a policy and would continue to do so throughout the 1960s. This was something that could only be fully realized when everyone got on board with it. At the same time, though, segregationists could not, as they thought, delay this sort of thing forever. To a great extent, they had already lost the public relations battle, and even at the outset, they had never had the united support of white citizens. And the clearest evidence of this came from the schools themselves. We don't have a good estimate on how white students at Central High felt about the controversy they were caught up in, but when Van Buren students were polled at the height of the tension there, more than half were in favor of admitting African Americans, with fewer than a third definitely opposed. In Fayetteville, meanwhile, after several schools refused to play against them in football because of the presence of black athletes, team members voted unanimously to forfeit games rather than kick them out. This spirit of cooperation was far less evident in the Delta, as a rule, but even there, in towns and cities with something of a black middle class, such as Forest City, there was at least an effort by citizens on both sides of the line to keep the potential for violence contained. This wouldn't always be successful, unfortunately, and we'll see some examples of that as we go forward, but it did provide a reason to hope that, given enough time, the people of Arkansas would be able to work out the antagonism and division where desegregation was concerned. Even the fact that Faubus was, in fact, reelected in 1958 and then again in 1960 may have been less an indicator of how Arkansans felt about race relations than of their resentment at the federal government for sticking its nose into an issue where they believed it didn't belong and should have stayed out of for the good of everybody. However that might be, and of course one has to ask whether desegregation would have happened at all if not for the court's involvement, the civil rights movement was by no means over as the 50s gave way to the 60s. The ultimate fate of school desegregation was itself still in doubt, and this was, of course, hardly the only front in that broader battle. There was a whole array of public and private institutions still operating under the laws of Jim Crow, and moreover, voting rights for African Americans in the state were still highly restricted. So next time, as we move into the turbulent 1960s, we'll look at how Arkansas dealt with the evolving civil rights movement and the other social and economic trends of the decade.